We're already more than halfway through July. How did we get here? You know, it's a common experience. It seems like the older we get, the faster time flies. And what have we done with all of our time? What do we do with our time? Do we make hay while the sun shines, taking advantage of every single moment of every single day? Or do we waste it away doing nothing? And is doing nothing wasting it away? And when I was a boy, I wanted to be just like my dad. He was my hockey coach. He was my baseball coach. He was my hero. And one day, my parents were arguing, and I distinctly remember my dad saying, "All work and no play makes Val a dull boy." See, my dad was the king of leisure and the prince of play, and he would do anything he could to get out of work and to have a good time and take it easy. I think it was that weekend that I learned to mow the lawn. I was too small to push it from the handlebar up here, but I could duck under it and push from that crossbar there. You know, this was in the days before safety switches, and I could just flip this lever off of the spark plug, and if I grabbed the pull cord with both hands and pulled it over my shoulder really fast, I'd get it started, and off I'd go. And I grew up learning to work hard and play hard. And that's really stuck with me. I mean, today I'm still very competitive. But by the time I was 16, I was playing baseball, I was learning taekwondo, I was in my high school marching band playing trumpet, and I worked after school at Kmart to pay for all my activities. And then my dad left us. My mom had to take a second job to pay the bills, and all the chores at home fell upon me and my sister. And something had to give. So I gave up baseball. And by this time, I wanted to be anything but like my dad. In the words of Harry Chapin's Cats in the Cradle, those words echoed throughout my youth. And I grew up to be just like him, but different. Because instead of a life of leisure, I based my life off of productivity and my identity on what I could accomplish. Packing my schedule became a way of life. By my early 20s, I was a medic with the Air National Guard. I was working at Tulsa Regional Medical Center. I was teaching taekwondo, and I was taking 9 to 12 hours of college. I usually went to bed about midnight, and I'd get up about 4 in the morning, and my mother was concerned about me. She's like, "Daniel, you're burning the candle at both ends." And my response was always, "I'll sleep when I'm dead." But Jesus said, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest." And somehow in the middle of all this, I managed to complete Bible college. I fell in love. I got married, and I found 2 new career paths. I was working full-time for Gerber Baby Foods. I was running the children's ministry at church, and I was teaching taekwondo as an outreach ministry. I desperately wanted to be a full-time pastor. I definitely wanted to impress my bosses, and I deeply wanted to provide a good living for my wife. And it was paying off because I was starting to get recognized as I was climbing that ladder of success. Except, not everything was so good back at home. I figured this was just only temporary, that soon I just knew I would get my breakthrough, that it was only a matter of time before I get my big break and go into ministry full time, and then I could leave the factory behind, and I could be that pastor and have more time. And I remember it was the 4th of July weekend. The factory was shut down. There were no major activities at the church. I actually had a little bit of free time. So I got up early and I went and worked out with some friends, and I came home a few hours later, and my wife met me at the door. She had 2 suitcases and a few boxes packed. And she was leaving me. And there was nothing I could do or say to change her mind and convince her to stay. And I had poured out everything I had with hardly any rest. I had taken it all on, all the responsibility, all the burden, all the weight, and all of my productivity and my pleasing the world became this Sisyphean effort of pushing this ever-expanding, ever-increasingly larger boulder up this never-ending hill. And I sacrificed my marriage for it. It was too much. And I collapsed spiritually and mentally and physically broken. And Jesus said, "Come to me, all who are carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest." You know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and everything in between. And then God took a day and rested. Not because God needed to, but because God wanted to. God was setting an example. God wanted to set an example for you and for me, for us, to give us a gift. And that gift was the first Sabbath. And that Sabbath was the first promise that somehow God would take care of us. That very first gift, that very first blessing, that very first promise that God gives us is the Sabbath, a time to rest. Now, I'm still learning how to embrace this. Because there are times when I get caught up in the work or I get caught up in the business, even when I think I've got it a good excuse or it's for a good cause. You know, like when I work all day and then most evenings for several weeks straight because the people need me or the church needs me or I feel like the staff already has too much to do or this is just something that I have to do. Sometimes I get the hint when I go home and I realize the grass is halfway up to my knees because I haven't mown the lawn in 3 weeks. Or when my wife says, "Hey, Daniel, when are you going to take that kayak out fishing?" Or when are you going to take that motorcycle out for a ride because you need to relax? Or sometimes when she takes my hand and says, "I'd like some time too." Sometimes my body just says it's had enough. As someone who rarely gets sick, I'll find my body in full rebellion and I'll be laid up on the couch when a friend calls me and says, "Hey, were you working too much?" You know, I'm still learning how to be a good example, and I need to be a better example for my family and for the church. And the church needs to be a better example for the world of how we rest and how to take Sabbath. Because Jesus says, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." A couple of years ago, I was on a spiritual retreat, and we spent a few days studying the Catholic priest and famous monk Thomas Merton. And I was reminded that we are created in God's image. And in the words of Merton, God is nothing. God is no thing. God just is. And that since we are made in God's image as human beings, we are made to be, not as human doings to do. So there are times when I must remember that I need to stop, that we need to stop and simply be as we commune with God and one another. Because Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest." because my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And we know that the yoke is that harness that are placed on a pair of oxen so that they can work together, so they can split the load, so they can be more efficient. Yet that's not what Jesus is talking about. Here in the rabbinical tradition, at that time, a rabbi's yoke was his teaching. It was his way of life. And the disciples would follow and live into the rabbi's way of life. They would imitate him and be like him. Yes, Jesus shares our burdens. But what's more importantly is he's telling me, he's telling us to drop what you think is important and to do what Jesus thinks is important. And to Jesus, what's important is to love and to be loved. And Sabbath, rest, communion is about loving and being loved. And to be loved is to find that sense of belonging and acceptance and celebration with God in a time of worship. And we find this love and this acceptance and this celebration best with those closest to us, with our family and our friends, with each other. You know, as Americans, we have this amazing holiday that we call Thanksgiving, and we celebrate it once every year. Yet God created the Sabbath so we could celebrate Thanksgiving at least once a week. And sometimes this is a struggle because we have to learn to love God enough so I can trust God enough to allow God to handle for a single day whatever it is I think that it is that I have to do. Whatever it is I think that only I can do. Because Jesus says, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." On a recent trip to Sedona, Arizona, I took a seminar on Brene Brown's Daring Greatly, and if you haven't read her book, it's excellent. You should read it. But it's about developing resiliency, and the seminar was developing resiliency in ministry, and during the seminar, I wrote myself a note, and it said, it's okay to slow down. It's okay to rest. Because while it's important to work hard and when appropriate to play hard, what's better at times is to fully rest. And that we being here together right now, you and I, taking this time to worship, to give thanks to God, it's just the beginning of our day. Because God didn't just give us Sunday mornings, He gave us the whole day to be and to love and to be loved. Because Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest." It's so easy for me to enmesh what I do as my purpose and to think that what I do and what I accomplish is who I am. That's my identity. And sometimes I think that if I stop doing something, then my identity will stop, that I won't be who I am, and that what needs to be done doesn't get done. And that's heavy. That's an exhausting anxiety. But maybe my identity is not what I do and not what I accomplish. Maybe my purpose is to simply be. And then I can go to Jesus and find rest, because maybe where I'm supposed to be is with Jesus, at rest or rested with Jesus. Kate Bowler recently interviewed Liz Gilbert, And Liz Gilbert's the author of Eat, Pray, Love. And in the interview, Liz talks about our purpose as people and how she always wrestled with her purpose and her identity outside of her occupation. And she explained that we often tend to overthink this. We often overthink of who we are and what we're supposed to do, that we think that there is this one unique purpose that we're supposed to do, that we're supposed to fulfill, that only we can do it, and that we must find, we must discover, we must go out and find that purpose and figure out what it is. But that it's not enough that we figure out what it is, that we just find it, because then we must live into it. We must become that purpose. We must do that purpose. But then living into it and doing and finding that purpose, that isn't enough, because then we must master that purpose, that one activity that only we can do, that we must tame it and become really good at it. But then becoming really good at it, mastering that one purpose is enough, because then we must rise to the top. We must become better than anyone else. But then becoming better than anyone else isn't enough, because then we must, besides being better than everyone else, we must monetize it. And then make a living off of it, and then monetizing it and making a living off of it, and doing all that. That's not enough, because then we must lift others up with it. We have to lift everyone up with it we can, because that becomes our identity of lifting others up with it. But then that's not enough, because then we must, and on and on and on and on and on we go. This never-ending cycle. She shares that one day she's walking down the sidewalk downtown and down the street, and there's this guy who is working on this really tall ladder, and he's way up on the ladder, and he doesn't have a harness, and the ladder is all wobbly, and there's nobody at the bottom spotting him or holding the ladder. She's really worried about him. So she walks over and she grabs and holds the ladder for him. And she physically stands there for 45 minutes holding this ladder. As this guy is doing his thing and working his way down, when he finally gets to low enough to what she thinks is a safe height, then she walks off. And she never says a word to the guy. In fact, she's not even sure he was ever aware that she was ever there. But as she walks away, in that moment, something occurred to her. Maybe being there at that moment and holding that ladder for that guy, maybe that was her one special purpose. And maybe she accomplished that higher purpose that only she could do. And then suddenly, it relieved her of all this, so much anxiety she'd been carrying around. As we think about this, doesn't all that anxiety that we carry seem sound and seem so ridiculous? Because maybe our purpose isn't what we do. Maybe it's to be present with God and one another, to be present with Jesus, and to start with one day, maybe right now, and to give it to Him. And that what doesn't get done that one day, well, then it doesn't get done. At least not by you. And then we learn to be okay with that. Because Jesus doesn't see you for what you do. Jesus doesn't see you for what you accomplish. He sees you for who you are. And you are a child of God. You are His beloved. And He sees you. He sees all that you're carrying carrying all that you can handle and probably trying to carry more than what you can handle. He sees you in all your worry, in all your stress, in all your anxiety, and he says, "Come to me. Come to me, all who are weary. Come to me, all who are struggling. Come to me, all who are carrying heavy loads. Come to me, and I will give you rest." May we come to Jesus, and may we learn to let go of our anxiety and simply be, and be with him. And may we find rest in his presence. Because being with Jesus is never a waste of time. Amen.